Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
This is Kurt Repencheck, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Recently, I read The Wolverine Way by Douglas Chadwick. It's a book from 2012 that really dives into the life of wolverines, a small mammal with a cantankerous reputation that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service late last year announced would be listed as a threatened species. The book is a fascinating biography, if you will, of wolverines. Chadwick has an engaging writing style, and Glacier National Park provides a fascinating backdrop for the story, two things that keep the story flowing. One thing he mentions that struck me is how important Glacier National Park is for the wolverine's survival. He notes that the surrounding national forests offer much the same habitat that wolverines need, but points out that the national forests don't provide the same protections from hunting and trapping that national parks do. Of course, with wolverines gaining protection under the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species, the animals will have the same protections on national forests and other public lands. Still, do we sometimes take for granted the protections national parks provide for species that are either losing habitat elsewhere or don't have the same protections from hunting and development that the parks provide? To continue this discussion, we're joined today by Kent Redford, who runs Archipelago Consulting, through which he helps individuals and organizations improve their practice of conservation, and Bart Melton and Ryan Valdez from the National Parks Conservation Association. Bart is the Senior Director of NPCA's Wildlife Program, while Ryan is the Association's Senior Director for Conservation Science and Policy. We'll be back in a minute with Kent, Bart, and Ryan.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Gentlemen, welcome to The Traveler. Thanks for making time.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Kurt.
So as I mentioned, I wonder if the more than 320 million visitors who head out to the national parks each year, many who come to see wildlife, take for granted the role that the parks play for species, whether they're endangered, threatened, or doing fine. What do you guys think? Is it something that, people just don't take for granted?
Ryan has Shenandoah as his actual backyard, so I'd be interested how he feels about visitors' views on wildlife and visitation. But maybe you could start us off, Ryan.
Sure. No, thank you. It's wonderful living right next to a national park, and so I see the traffic daily. I hear from a lot of park visitors, and a lot of them come here to see the wildlife, obviously, and to experience the nature. But I think it is true, Kurt, what you were suggesting, that we might not be fully aware of all the things that threatened and endangered species and other species really bring to parks. And, they're great for helping healthier parks and communities sort of obtain some of the legal protections you hear about later. They clearly help bring in money, staff and management upgrades to our parks. A lot of great science comes to our parks and park landscapes because of these, listed species. And stronger local economies really enjoy a stream of visitors, obviously, that flock into these gateway communities. So there's a lot that's connected to the species. And I'm always reminded that when we think of wildlife where we're really thinking of our values that we feel about wildlife, whether it's utilitarian, whether it's moral and aesthetic, economic and ecological, but they bring and they connect our values, to these park landscapes. And so there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and we don't know it. We just go there to enjoy the beautiful wildlife.
Yeah. Kent, let me put it another way. One thing that has eaten at me for some years now is that we always hear about national parks as economic engines and how much money they bring into the gateway communities. Does that really cast a pall on the natural capital that these places preserve? I mean, I've been looking into that issue recently, and there are studies on the value of grizzly bears. The wolves in Yellowstone, it's been said that they've brought in $35 million a year in tourism. Is that, should we be weighing national parks more for the value of the wildlife that they protect and preserve than for the cash registers and the dining rooms?
So the problem is the visibility, right? If visitors want to see animals, then they are wanting to see management protocols that cause animals to be visible by them. But you end up with situations like in Yosemite with black bears causing huge problems in campgrounds and in garbage pits and what have you. And you have Yellowstone reversing many years ago its policy towards feeding bears in garbage pits. People got to see the bears, but it was decided that, as Ryan said, the values of the bears as garbage hounds versus the bears as ecological actors needed to be stewarded by the Park Service, which is not in the business of producing, evening shows for the visitors at the garbage dump, which is what it used to be. And many people may have followed the fact that Pierce Brosnan was fined $1,500 for stepping off the path in Yellowstone and in the thermal springs areas. And one of the kinds of wildlife that people really that isn't interpreted enough for people are the microbes. So the microbial communities, the microscopic organisms living in those hot springs are incredibly important. There was a great study that showed there's more diversity in the microbes in Yellowstone's hot springs than in all the birds and mammals and reptiles found in the rest of the park. So if it's just the economic value, then you don't ever get to value the smaller things that people may not get an appreciation for. And that's what concerns me if it's too much, if the wildlife is too much visitor access driven, as opposed to scenery. Being able to walk a path, to walk through canyons and what have you is a fine thing and may produce the kind of money we'd like to see rather than insisting on seeing moose run across the road.
Yeah, I think these are all valid and important points. I think something that stands out to me is having worked with NPCA's wildlife team in the field and here in Washington, D.C. over the past few years is the passion that visitors and park enthusiasts bring to wildlife conservation, and that excitement at spotting the first grizzly bear of their lives at Yellowstone, or finding a mussel in the creek at Big South Fork, or many of the other sort of lucky sightings a person can have along the way in parks that are a little less lucky if they happen to be with an interpretive ranger who's explaining what they're seeing in a real world way, which can be really helpful. And I think that gets at the question of, sure, wildlife and visitation, these are economic drivers, and parks play an important role in communities, and that is a critical connection, but also people are passionate about the species that make parks unique. And telling those stories and protecting those species is kind of the challenge of our time amidst the global biodiversity crisis and the impacts of climate change and sort of constant underfunding of threatened and endangered species conservation writ large, with 600 threatened and endangered species, plus, depending on national parks and their broader landscapes for all or part of their lives, it's really important that we put the money on the table to take care of those species, and maybe now more than ever. So I think there's how we draw the connection between visitor interest and enthusiasm and wildlife and plants as economic drivers of visitation to real world conservation of those species and funding through Congress, I think is the puzzle we're constantly trying to solve and have yet to figure out.
Yeah. It's interesting. As Kent was alluding to, it wasn't always the National Park Service that was protecting these species. I mean, they allowed for the bear feeding at Yellowstone, and I think at Yosemite there might have been some programs like that going on too. And of course, when the National Park Service was first established, we had the eradication of the predators, of the wolves and the mountain lions, and I think there was even some efforts to get rid of the grizzly bears and maybe the black bears too. And we've really come 180 degrees from that, fortunately. As a society, has society moved along with that too? Have we put on a greater value on those wildlife resources?
Yeah, I think we have. And I think that I think Bart, who made reference to the kind of biodiversity crisis. So I like to think that people have a vision of nature as more than just the moose or the bison or the black bears. And particularly bird watchers, exemplify the ways to spread the riches and spread the enthusiasm to a broader set of species. And certainly in marine parks, the scuba diving and skin diving, to be able to look at corals and fish hopefully in a relatively in a way that doesn't impact them, is a way of keeping visitor interest. So if we can interpret the parks as being for more than just the large animals, which of course they are, but that may give people a greater interest and a sense of satisfaction in seeing a beaver dam, sitting at a beaver dam, even though you don't see a beaver, understanding the nature of the hydrological processes and all the species that rely on that damming, I hope is a way of giving people a much richer experience than just seeing a particular animal.
It's interesting. I think you get to a great point, Kent, about how much we don't realize is out there. I mean, on an average basis. I mean, we know there are wolves, we know there are grizzly bears and moose and bison in the national parks, but how many really know about the elkhorn or the staghorn corals or the devil's hole pupfish and the roles that they play in the endemic birds in the Haleakala National Park in Hawaii, Volcanoes National Park in Hawaii.
Yeah, and it makes it difficult to, I think, to talk about invasive species too. Because I'm not sure that and this is just a guess on my part, that many people don't understand why you would want to shoot goats in Volcanoes National Park, and why it's so important to do so when people say, oh, look, it's a goat, look, it's a baby goat, and then it gets shot and they get very upset about it. Plants seem to be less a problem, but saints preserve us from horses and cats.
Horses are a particularly interesting species in the national park system. In some parks, we don't like feral horses. In some parks, we love feral horses. I know, Kent, I believe you and Elaine Leslie just produced a paper last fall for the National Park Service at Cape Hatteras National Seashore about the Ocracoke ponies and their role in the national seashore there.
Yeah, and Theodore Roosevelt. Oh my goodness me! Wow, what a mess.
In Cumberland Island, where there's a lawsuit, and I'm thankful I'm not a Park Service manager, because you look at these different competing values, and how do you stay close to the true mission of the National Park Service when you start bringing emotions into those decisions? Ryan, you probably never run into that, do you?
Not at all. And as I'm hearing this discussion, I'm also realizing, I think people get that parks are home to many of these beautiful wildlife species, but maybe for only part of their life cycle. I think people are starting to understand more and more that parks can't exist in isolation. They are intricately dependent upon the matrix of habitat that surrounds them. Bart and I work in such a way that parks act as anchors for large landscape conservation. And so we get to really sometimes focus on beyond boundaries issues. And I think people understand that. I think they understand that parks aren't just protected. They need the habitat around them, and they need people to support them. And it's the wildlife that come and go that I think bring this message in, with migrations, with corridors. You know, it's really fascinating to watch, but I think the information's getting out there, and there's something bigger around parks that parks are highly dependent on. So I'm glad to see that coming through, not just in the community, but also in the sciences. Lots of research on large landscape conservation that involve parks as anchors for those areas. So this is a terrific time for science to get involved.
You know, there's an interesting situation in California between Yosemite and Kings Canyon National Parks, the big national forest out there, and the desire by some to see it made part of the national park system because you do have roads and hunting in the Sierra National Forest, and the wildlife would be better protected if it became part of the national park system. And so I guess that leads to a bigger question of, you know, if you make that happen in California, where do you stop? You know, where is the appropriate buffer for a national park to protect wildlife?
It's always a question. I think we lean towards the importance of, and where the Endangered Species Act has been most successful, I think, is where collaboration across jurisdictions and user groups has been at the core of conservation conversations. And, you know, I don't want to lean into big charismatic predators, but the grizzly bear at Yellowstone is certainly a great example of where the success to the point we're at today, which is not without conflict and contradiction, the success that we've reached today is in large part a result of ranchers, tribes, states, different federal land management agencies all coming together, landowners all coming together to bring that species back. Now, there's been some high-profile disagreement on what recovery looks like and when we've reached recovery, and you know, maybe that's inevitable, but it's also a sign of success. We went from grizzly bears, as Kent alluded to earlier, grizzly bears and black bears eating in trash dumps for visitors at Yellowstone to one of the great North American conservation success and recovery stories that we're seeing unfold today. But it's not without conflict. And to Ryan's point, that is at its core large landscape conservation. And in so many spaces around the country, national parks and the species they serve to protect under their mission are better conserved today because of national parks. It requires beyond boundary thinking and thinking about what conservation looks like at the landscape scale and in the context of real living landscapes. You know, Native American tribes have been on the ground in these spaces for thousands of years. And with European settlement, we've had a mix of management styles, of land uses. It's a complicated story to unfold and to figure out sort of where conservation goes now amidst the challenges of our times, going back to the biodiversity crisis and climate change. These are tough issues, and grizzly bears is a great example of all those issues coming together at once. And it's not exceptional. that story can be told in park landscapes around the country, whether it's Florida panther or native plant restoration at Hawaii volcanoes on down the line. Just some really complicated yet also uplifting stories that have unfolded as a result of parks, and I think have a more forward-facing direction now than we've had in a really long time, but lots of challenges.
You know, you mentioned the controversy around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and grizzly bears. I'd be curious to hear all three of your views on the North Cascades Grizzly Recovery Program. I mean, how controversial is that going to be?
I've been lucky enough to work with our team on that one, and Kent and Ryan, and I think we all sat forward in our chairs there for the viewers at home. And this is a plan that a record of decision was signed recently, moving forward with the restoration of grizzly bears at North Cascades, where they haven't been seen in the wild since the mid-90s. And now the Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are moving forward with a plan to bring bears back. So a little context there for the viewers, the listeners at home. But Kent and Ryan, I saw you both sit forward, and I don't want to talk too much about this one, but it is exciting.
So if we circle back to your previous question, Kurt, and then connect it, it's, to me, the interesting thought experiment is that we wouldn't need national parks if people lived lightly on the land. You know, and the indigenous community example is a good one in most cases. So the California question is also the grizzly bear North Cascades question. It really isn't about the bears in the park, it's about the bears outside the park and how people, and it isn't really about the bears, it's about the people, right? So the conservation, I got trained in biology to become a conservation person, only to realize that I should have been trained in people to become a conservation person. And grizzly bears are the best example. Don't talk to the bear, talk to the person carrying the gun pointed at the bear. You know, I think the grizzly bear return is a tremendous success for many of us. To me, the success is not in a single species restoration, but it's in the restoration of a whole suite of interacting animals. So when grizzlies are preying on bison in native North American grassland ecosystems, I'm going to be happy. So I want the grizzlies with the bison on the grasslands. That's what I'm looking for, not just some minimum number of bears in some particular geography.
You know, a couple of years ago, I was working on a book about bison, and I went up to the American Prairie Reserve in northern Montana, and they told me that the grizzly bears were moving in that direction. And this was a few years ago, and I'm just wondering, any updates on that? Have they seen grizzly bears on the preserve?
They're starting to show up individual, probably dispersing young males into the more eastern portions of Montana. They're following the riparian forest along, but I'd imagine that many of them don't get very far before their lives are cut short. Let's put it that way.
Kent, you know, your work with WCA, I mean, you just are legendary, so I'm really honored to be on this call with you. But using apex predators for conservation is tricky in many levels. But the thing that I think is really important for the success for Northern Cascades here is what the bear represents. And this is the values. And I think people see it as wildness, you know? I mean, imagine Isle Royale without the wolves. And we almost had that. But knowing, even though you won't see them, knowing wolves are on that island, that's this magical, mystical, biological reaction. And I love this for North Cascades. I want to know and believe there are bears roaming around in that forest. I think that's what people want. And so it's a success for the ecology of the region, for many other things, but also because it touches our hearts. And I think that's a very big deal with this particular park in that place, in that wildness that ventures on up into Canada.
You know, this issue is a great example of the controversy that can exist around the recovery of threatened and endangered species. But it's also a great example of how we can work together to move forward with conservation of species. On the conflict side, I think the effort, obviously, to put large carnivores back on the landscape, there are going to be people that have legitimate concerns. People who live in communities on the edge of the park in the area, who could see bears again for the first time in over 30 years moving through that landscape. That really means that the conservation community, the tribes that have been supported, the communities that have been supported have to step up and actively engage and support the human side of that, as Kent alluded to earlier. And, that's something we've been talking a lot about with our partners on the ground and our staff on the ground. We can't simply say, here are grizzly bears and walk away. These are multi-decade efforts that require significant investments of time, money, and people on the ground, working with communities to make sure we have bear-safe communities, that we're educating hikers to carry bear spray and how to use it in spaces where they haven't had to in recent years. But the net result of that is something that Ryan alluded to that is really important: the conservation of wild spaces and the protection and restoration of intact ecosystems. And the Endangered Species Act plays such an important role in making that happen, and making sure that we don't lose the biological diversity that makes our country so unique in the world.
Do you think it's getting easier to get surrounding populations to see the value in grizzly bear recovery or wolf recovery or whatever species we're talking about? And I wonder about that because recently there was a grizzly mauling in Grand Teton National Park. A gentleman from Massachusetts got too close to bears for some reason or another. Nobody really knows the details, or at least the park hasn't released the details. But it was interesting in the comments that the traveler received on our various outlets, whether it's social media or on the website itself, was people were standing up for the bear saying, geez, I hope that they don't put the bear down because of this. That guy was in the wrong place. Are we going to see those types of emotions in communities that's throughout the North Cascades, for instance?
Yeah, I think living with any species is a challenge. And, we can use grizzly bears because it's one of the more complicated ones in the greater Yellowstone and receives a lot of attention. But, there are concerns and efforts on other species that relate to landowner use of their property, concerns that relate to federal infringement on property rights, long-standing points of contention, especially in the Western United States, that have made the Endangered Species Act a hot-button political issue at times. And what I can say is, I think it's really important, and I'd be interested in Kent's perspective on this too, that collaboration and partnership are the only way forward to protect these spaces. And we've made so much progress in the GYE, and any sort of negative interaction with the bear that involves a person where someone gets hurt is extremely upsetting, and it has a real human impact. And so what can we as a community do to prevent that from occurring? Those are the tough questions. But, protecting a mussel in the Big South Fork from upstream mining in Tennessee and Kentucky is controversial too in its own way, because the mining that is impacting that species is a livelihood for somebody and their family. And every endangered species decision we make is going to interact with people in some way, shape, or form. And that's going to get political. And when it gets political, we get into those who want to oppose the application of a law that's been our most effective tool for conservation maybe ever in this country, for wildlife conservation. and those that want to do better and do more. And threading the needle and figuring out how we move forward together in that conservation space is the big challenge. And that's a grizzly bear is a great example of that, but there's so much more there.
And I think we're in a sense, we're victims of our own success in that we have so emphasized park boundaries, as opposed to, as the Wolverine example you started with, Kurt, as opposed to the living quality of the organisms and the ecological interactions, such that, when that wolf set foot outside Yellowstone National Park, the governor of Montana trapped it or shot it. I forget which it was. I mean, for heaven's sakes, the wolf just stepped outside the park boundary, but those are the rules. And in the fishing community, they like the spillover that comes from marine reserves where there's no fishing, because then there are more fish when you fish right on the edges of it. But we're saying a fish is not the same as a wolf or a grizzly bear. But in both cases, it's the boundary that's the problem, and saying the rules apply from here in, and there are different rules that apply from here out. And this is going to be particularly a problem as climate change continues its inexorable changes. I was at a meeting last year called Species on the Move, held in southern Florida. And so it featured a lot of people from the Everglades National Park. And the maps they show about the changes in high tide levels in Everglades National Park have meant that, as one person said, Riley, we're starting to have much more marine park than we ever had before, because that's what it's turning into. And so the question has then become what the boundary of the park is, if it's actually in the marine setting, and what species are they looking at, and how can they keep things that are really not going to be able to stay, as, for example, as the water levels rise in the area of the Florida Keys decreases, and you have bunnies and you have mice and you have deer that are all going to go, oh my God, I can't survive here very much longer. And I had a colleague who worked a lot in the Adirondacks Park, which is not a national park, but it is a park. And his program's philosophy comes from that. I don't think it's still running, that television commercial for the Motel 6, I think it was, and their catchphrase was, "We'll leave the lights on." And they were managing Adirondack Park not for what was going, but for what was coming, which I thought was an incredibly enlightened view, because they're at the very edge, the southern limit of boreal species, which are moving north inexorably. But they got a whole suite of things moving north who are going to be in the park. And that's the boundary issue, and not taking into account the change that's happening all around us. It's going to be a big challenge for all of us moving forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And our focus today, of course, is on animal species. But you can talk about birds, you can talk about reptiles, you can talk about trees, and climate change is impacting all those. And I know I was talking to somebody at the Schoodic Institute in Acadia, and how their tree species are going to be changing as climate change continues. Circling back to becoming more comfortable with some of these species inside and outside of national parks, are we seeing that? And I raise that question because we've seen wolves migrate down into California, I believe, out of Washington State and Oregon. We've seen Mexican wolves coming up from Mexico into northern New Mexico.
And jaguars.
And of course, in the eastern U.S. and North Carolina, we're seeing the recovery plans for the red wolf move forward. And at the same time, as a backdrop, perhaps, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. The Biden administration's 30 by 30 effort to conserve public lands and waters for biodiversity. It's almost an enlightenment, isn't it, of wildlife ecology? Or is that too grand of a statement?
What do you think, Bart?
Seems like a big philosophical question for a scientist, not a policy person. Kent, what do you think?
Well, The Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal Declaration, says that they would like to see that all the signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity should consider collectively conserving 30% of the Earth's land and ocean area. That's never going to fly in the US per se. So I forget what it's called. It's called America the Beautiful or something like that. It's a wonderful rephrasing of that to get away from this interpretation that that's somehow a UN mandate that's designed to restrict the rights of proper American citizens. But it's what's necessary, but it's also not enough. It's back to the earlier point. We need to right place solar farms. We need to right place wind turbines. We need to right place highways and dams and all the rest of it. We can't say, okay, 70% we don't care about, 30% we're going to save. That's not going to work, as we've been talking all the way along, because stuff doesn't stay inside those boundaries. So it's a good start, but it's only a start. And it's the integrated land use planning, I think, that's really going to be a necessary way to get us out of this mess.
It's interesting in some aspects. Perhaps the national parks can be seen as reservoirs for these species that, as their population increases, they can serve as a source population. Absolutely. I mean, there's some places where you won't have that. I mean, the Devil's Hole pupfish is not going to leave Devil's Hole, but you've got the bison situation and the bison initiative that Interior Secretary Kempthorne launched so many years ago, and seems to be moving forward today. And you look at the landscapes where we could have bison. I mean, it's not going to turn the clock back to 1850 or 1800 with bison, tromping across Kansas. But there are lots of places in the Midwest that could support bison. And where you have bison, you have all the associated species that benefit from those bison.
And the East. Don't forget, bison were in the East. George Washington shot some. So we can't neglect returning bison back to the grasslands of the southeastern U.S.
Well, and I believe there was an effort to return bison to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, wasn't there, in the early 1900s, and that failed.
No, I think you raise a good point, and it's really a question of how we proceed with those restoration efforts. Bison conservation at Yellowstone has always been a hot button issue since that last remnant herd was found deep in the park's boundaries. And that's a really special herd because, that's the last of the bison that roamed freely in North America that were decimated as part of European expansion, and also, you could argue an effort to force Native Americans onto reservations and other lands. So that species has a complicated history in line with our country's complicated history. And what appropriate restoration of that species looks like is a really important cultural question for us as a country. And it's a question of what justice looks like. And the conversation 20 years ago at Yellowstone was transfer of brucellosis, which is a disease that transfers from bison to cattle, and vice versa, by the way. And that was kind of the sticking point about bison moving beyond park boundaries, because, as you know, during the winter months at Yellowstone, it gets pretty tough in the park, and even big burly bison have to migrate down to lower ground to find grass in the toughest of winters. And when those bison would migrate out, concerns over disease management, concerns over grazing, concerns over walking out your door and running into 1,000-pound bull bison between your front door and your car was a challenge for community members there. And I think in some ways those challenges still exist, but we've also moved beyond that to a more important point. You now have year-round grazing allotments for bison beyond park borders at Yellowstone, you now have access to habitat in a space that didn't exist. And that was a battle of inches for the conservation community and the Park Service and others to get there, to find consensus and agreement where it didn't exist for a really long time between the state of Montana and ranchers and others. And that's been positive. But the next phase in that is, of course, we'd like to see more bison appropriately placed in parks where they could add ecological value. But there's also a cultural question in the restoration of bison to tribal lands and bringing bison from Yellowstone back to tribes rather than shipping them to slaughter annually as part of an antiquated bison management strategy. All that is to say, these are really complicated issues, to make an obvious point, but parks serve such an important value in helping us conserve these species and helping us have these tough conversations and think about what ecological improvement looks like and what justice looks like. And park wildlife's right there at the center of it. And that's what makes this work so exciting. But it also makes it really challenging for where we go amidst monumental change.
Do you think it's challenging for lack of information? I mean, grizzly bears make front page of newspapers, wolves to a certain extent, especially when their muzzles are taped shut with duct tape. But, you look at elkhorn and staghorn corals and such a wonderful species and the threats that they're facing, the endemic birds of Hawaii and the threats that they're facing. And you can just go on, and you look at national parks and the role they play in protecting these. I mean, you can even look at the humpback whale in Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve in Alaska and the role it provides for those species. I mean, you look out across the park system, and it brings so much excitement and hope for species because they are succeeding in protecting in a lot of cases. Whether you want to talk about mussels in Big South Fork or the salamanders and the hellbenders in Great Smoky Mountains or Shenandoah.
I always want to talk about hellbenders. Let's be clear.
Maybe you should explain to our listeners what a hellbender is, and not a Friday night in downtown DC.
Yeah, a hellbender is a very large salamander that lives in southern Appalachia and other parts of the country in park units. Kent would probably have more to say on the unique biology of the hellbender, but I'd say Google it. They have lots of colorful nicknames beyond hellbender that are fairly entertaining.
And that we won't use on this radio show. No, they're fabulous animals, and they're a charismatic animal that hasn't gotten the attention that it needs. So somebody makes the T-shirt, I'll buy one.
Well, really, I mean, you look at a lot of these friends groups in the West, and you donate $25 and you get a plush bison or you get a plush wolf. I mean, hellbender's not very plush, but if more people knew of the plight of the hellbenders, perhaps there would be more interest in saving their habitats.
Absolutely right.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for indulging me in this conversation today. I know it was kind of a free-form flowing conversation about wildlife in the national parks, but I do think it's good to remind folks who go out to the national parks and who might be intrigued by a national park of the wonders that they play in biological conservation.
A pleasure. Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks very much. Great talking to you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Next week, we're going to take a dive into the archives at Great Smoky Mountains National Park to take a look at some of the letters written to park managers down through the decades, and some letters that predated the national park but were penned by area residents. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, These musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.